can't wait to see you, Grandma. Thanksgiving wouldn't be the same without you? That's what the message said. Kendall even added a heart emoji, which she rarely used. I packed the scarf I had knitted, the chocolate truffles she liked, and the cardigan I wore for holidays. I booked the ticket myself, seat 80A. I remember because I chose the window, thinking maybe I'd get to see the mountain ridge before we landed in Portland. But the only thing I saw was a terminal full of strangers being claimed. I stood at gate B2 of PDX for 47 minutes. My coat folded neatly over one arm, my suitcase beside me. People swirled around with balloons, flowers, signs that said welcome home. A child ran into his father's arms. A woman clutched her sister and cried. I waited and waited. Then, just as I was about to dial Scott's number again, my phone buzzed. Not a call. A notification. Social media. I tapped it. There they were. Scott, Kendall, the three kids around a table. Mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, wine glasses raised. The caption read, "Full house, full hearts. Happy Thanksgiving." My hand stopped moving. I scanned every face. I wasn't in the frame. I wasn't even in the house. I stood still as voices and suitcases passed. My ears rang. My coat slipped a little down my arm, but I didn't adjust it. I felt like a package delivered to the wrong address. I had texted them twice. Landed, just got a gate B2. Then, 20 minutes later, still here. Let me know where to meet. Nothing. It wasn't the first time I'd felt forgotten, but it was the first time I let myself believe it. I turned. Not out of anger, but out of something harder to name, a kind of quiet clarity. Outside the terminal, the air was colder than I remembered. I pulled the cardigan tight across my chest and wheeled my suitcase toward the shuttle signs. Not knowing where I was going, just knowing it wouldn't be to their house. "You said you wanted me here," I whispered to the wind. "But you never looked for me?" "Would you have waited longer, or walked away too?" The last time I flew to Portland for Thanksgiving, Alan was still alive. We had arrived together. He had carried my bag even though his hip was already giving him trouble. I remember how he grunted but smiled through it. "Gotta keep up appearances," he had whispered, nudging me with his elbow. Back then, they used to meet us at the gate, the kids holding signs that said, "Grandma and Grandpa." It was 2015. Scott had grilled the turkey that year. He'd worn a ridiculous apron with "Mate Boss" printed in red. Alan kept calling him Chef Boy, "Oh boy." The twins were little then, all curls and loud questions. Hannah had helped me mash the sweet potatoes, carefully adding cinnamon like I showed her. That house used to hum with noise, with layers of voices over each other, dishes clattering, music too loud in the kitchen. The kind of chaos that makes a place feel full, not crowded. I had baked 2 pies, pecan and pumpkin. They were gone by noon the next day. After dinner, Alan and I had taken our coffee to the deck, wrapped in the shared silence that comes after hosting. He'd reached for my hand and said, "They'll be okay. Even when we're not here one day." I'd said nothing, just squeezed back. He died 2 years later. That next Thanksgiving, I still went. It was quieter. The signs the kids made were printed, not drawn. No one met me at the gate. The house still had warmth, but it felt thinner, like a memory being replayed one frame slower. Kendall asked me that year if I still wanted to bake or just bring wine. I baked. Each year, since I tried to believe that what was fading could still be saved, I baked pies. I wrapped gifts. I asked about schools, birthdays, sports games. I stayed in the group chat even when no one answered. This year I told myself would be different. But it was, just not in the way I'd hoped. The last time I flew to Portland for Thanksgiving, Alan was still alive. We had arrived together. He had carried my bag even though his hip was already giving him trouble. I remember how he grunted but smiled through it. "Gotta keep up appearances," he had whispered, nudging me with his elbow. Back then, they used to meet us at the gate, the kids holding signs that said, "Grandma and Grandpa." It was 2015. Scott had grilled the turkey that year. He'd worn a ridiculous apron with "Mate Boss" printed in red. Alan kept calling him Chef Boy. "Oh boy." The twins were little then, all curls and loud questions. Hannah had helped me mash the sweet potatoes, carefully adding cinnamon like I showed her. That house used to hum with noise, with layers of voices over each other, dishes clattering, music too loud in the kitchen. The kind of chaos that makes a place feel full, not crowded. I had baked 2 pies, pecan and pumpkin. They were gone by noon the next day. After dinner, Alan and I had taken our coffee to the deck, wrapped in the shared silence that comes after hosting. He'd reached for my hand and said, "They'll be okay, even when we're not here one day." I'd said nothing, just squeezed back. He died 2 years later. That next Thanksgiving, I still went. It was quieter. The signs the kids made were printed, not drawn. No one met me at the gate. The house still had warmth, but it felt thinner, like a memory being replayed one frame slower. Kendall asked me that year if I still wanted to bake or just bring wine. I baked. Each year since, I tried to believe that what was fading could still be saved. I baked pies. I wrapped gifts. I asked about schools, birthdays, sports games. I stayed in the group chat even when no one answered. This year I told myself would be different. But it was, just not in the way I'd hoped. Chapter 20, What Thanksgiving Used to Mean Part 2. The motel room smelled faintly of old soap and dusted carpets. The heater wheezed every few minutes like an asthmatic dog. I kept my coat on. The tray on the bedside table held a sandwich I hadn't touched. A plastic-wrapped cookie. An unopened bottle of ginger ale. I stared at the sandwich until it became part of the wallpaper. From my bag, I pulled out the scarf I'd knitted for Kendall. Pale gray with moss green trim. Her colors, not mine. I held it in my lap like a sleeping pet. I didn't cry. Instead, I reached for the small photo I always kept in my wallet. Alan in his brown sweater, holding baby Hannah, both of them looking toward something I wasn't in the frame to see. I remembered how that photo was taken. I had been in the kitchen, slicing apples, listening to Alan sing softly to her while the others watched football. That day felt so long ago. My phone screen lit up. Still no new messages. I tapped the old text I had sent an hour earlier, still here. Let me know where to meet. I stared at the words, as if staring could make them mean something. Then I powered the phone off. The silence was louder than any reply could have been. I folded the scarf neatly, slowly, then placed it back in the bag. Some things don't belong where they're not wanted. In the morning, I woke up to the sound of the heater clunking, then silence. For a moment, I forgot where I was. I reached across the empty bed, half expecting to brush Alan's hand. Nothing. The air was still. I sat up slowly, my knees stiff from the cold and the years. My coat was still buttoned. I hadn't even taken off my shoes. I turned my phone back on. Still no messages. I called Scott. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I waited 15 minutes. Then I called again. This time someone picked up. Hello. It was Kendall. Her voice wasn't cold. It was worse. It was casual. Oh, hey, Marjorie. Sorry, yesterday was just bananas. The twins had food poisoning from school or something. We weren't sure if Thanksgiving was even happening. I said nothing. She kept talking. By the time things settled down, it felt too late to do anything. And we figured you. Well, maybe you just stayed in Missoula. You know, we never got a confirmation. I stared at the wall. Pale yellow. Cracked near the curtain rod. I texted twice, I said. Oh. Maybe it didn't go through. These phones, I swear. Anyway, it was a blur. Everyone's a bit wiped out. You know how it is. No apology, no offer, no mention of the scarf. Or the pie. Or the fact that I'd sat alone with a ginger ale while they toasted to family. Well, I'm glad you're safe, she added. We should catch up soon. Click. She hung up first. I looked down at my hands, still gripping the phone like it might warm me. But it never had. I checked out of the motel just after 9. The sky was a dull pewter, low clouds pressing down like a thought you can't shake. I didn't call a cab. I walked. The wheels of my suitcase clicked unevenly over the sidewalk cracks. My feet knew where I was going before I did. Vera's Diner. The one Alan and I always stopped at before heading home. Back when Thanksgiving ended with leftovers and not silence. The bell above the door jingled. Same as always. Inside, the smell of coffee, maple syrup, and something fried wrapped around me like a blanket I didn't ask for but needed. Take any booth you like, hon, the waitress said. Her name tag still read Linda. I sat by the window, same booth as always. Alan had liked the view. The place hadn't changed. Neither had I. Not really. The menu still had Alan's favorite country, fried steak with scrambled eggs. I ordered it not because I wanted it, but because memory does strange things with taste. As I stirred the coffee, I noticed something. No one here looked rushed. No one ignored the person across from them. I ate half the meal, folded the rest into a napkin and tucked it away. Then I opened my phone, stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't text them. Instead, I typed a single sentence into the Notes app. I'm not going back. And I meant it. The manila folder was older than I remembered. A bit warped from years in the cabinet, edges curling like dried leaves. I hadn't opened it since 2020, the year Scott asked for help with the refinancing. It was after Alan passed. The pandemic was still keeping people apart, and Scott had called with a voice full of urgency and soft pressure. Mom, it's just paperwork. We need your name on the cabin so the bank sees enough equity. It's still yours, just technical. Trust me, I remember sitting at my small kitchen table with the documents he'd overnighted. I had made tea, opened the window, and read the first page twice. But the legal language blurred. I signed anyway. Because he was my son. Because Kendall had just lost her job and the twins needed braces, and they talked about maybe selling the cabin if things didn't improve. I didn't want it sold. It was the only piece of land Alan and I ever owned together, nestled beside a lake near Flathead, the pine trees thick and proud. Alan built the back deck with his own hands. There were still faint initials we carved together on one of the steps. I had assumed that once their loan was done, they'd transfer it back. Quietly, respectfully. But this morning, in a diner booth with a folded napkin in my purse, I took out the folder and spread the pages. The deed had only one name. Scott's. My hands didn't shake. My tea went cold beside me. Linda came by to refill it, but I shook my head. Page after page, I found no trace of my name. Not as an owner. Not as anything, just a witness signature from 4 years ago. I folded the papers slowly. Not with anger. With recognition. People don't have to scream to erase you. Sometimes they do it with a soft voice and a pen. The bank was only a 15-minute walk. I took the long way. The sidewalk was slick from last night's drizzle, and the air held that sharpness November brings. The kind that feels clean until it cuts. I passed a shop with cedar wreaths in the window. Alan would have commented on the prices. $12 for twigs and string, he'd have muttered. I almost smiled. When I reached the bank, the door chimed softly. The same old scent of carpet and printer toner hit me like a memory I wasn't ready for. I recognized the woman at the front desk. Meredith. Her hair was grayer, but her eyes were just as kind. Mrs. Daniels. Oh my goodness, it's been years. I'm so sorry about Alan. We all liked him here. Thank you, Meredith. I need to check something. About the cabin. The one near Flathead Lake. She led me to a chair, typed quietly for a moment, then turned the screen slightly toward me. As of now, it's in Scott Daniels' name only. Has been since May 2020'd. I nodded. There's no joint ownership, no trust clause, none listed. Do you want me to print it out for you? Yes, please. She printed it, 3 pages. Stapled. Smiled faintly. Family things can be complicated. I hope it all works out, Umatu, I said. But I didn't mean it. Not the way she thought. As I stepped out into the chill again, the weight in my hands wasn't paper. It was clarity. And clarity is heavier than it looks. The house was still. Still in that way you don't notice when someone's alive inside it. Still like a question left unanswered. I closed the door behind me and set the keys on the counter. Alan's old dish still caught them with a familiar clink. A sound so small, it broke something open. The living room had the same olive green recliner he used to fall asleep in, the same dusty bookshelf he never got around to finishing. His slippers were still under the side table. I'd kept them there. I didn't know why. Maybe I hoped one day I'd believe he might walk back in. I sat down slowly. My legs weren't tired, but my spirit was tired of being surprised by pain. Tired of realizing just how alone I'd become. The house had never felt empty when Alan was in it, even when we were silent. Now the silence had weight. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the light. The fridge hummed, defiant and alive. But the space at the end of the counter, where Alan used to stand slicing carrots too thick for soup, was hollow. I touched the drawer he'd always forget to close. Opened it. Still had the tape measure and his blue pen. Still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old wood. I closed it again. That was when I felt it rising. Not tears. Resolve shaped like grief. Cold, but clean sharp, like the air that morning. I picked up the phone from the wall cradle. Pressed Hannah's number. She picked up after 2 rings. Grandma. Her voice was the same, light, like spring wind through a screen door. I just needed to hear you, I said. A pause, then softer. I'm glad you called. I'm okay. I lied. You sure? No, but I wouldn't say that. Just checking in. You and Mom doing okay? Another pause, this one longer. Yeah. You know the usual. School rehearsals. She's kind of tense lately. I didn't press. I didn't want her to lie for her mother. I just wanted to hear her voice. That little thread. Still intact. Still mine. After Hannah hung up, I stayed in the kitchen a while longer. The phone still in my hand, though the call was over. There had been warmth in her voice, but also restraint, like she was trading carefully between what she knew and what she couldn't yet say. I could hear it in the way she paused, the slight hesitation before each word. She was walking a tightrope, one I had once walked myself. I didn't want her to carry my sorrow. I wanted her to know I was still here. Still someone worth calling, still someone who mattered. I set the phone down slowly, like I was setting down something fragile, then walked to the hallway closet. It smelled like dust, cedar, and old linen, the kind of scent that only gathers in the corners of a life that's been lived slowly. I reached to the back, behind a stack of quilts Alan never let me donate. He used to say they held heat better than anything new. Maybe they just held memory. There where we used to hide Christmas gifts was the old box. Brown cardboard, the edges frayed. Alan's handwriting in black marker. Flathead legal and personal. My throat caught at the sight of his handwriting. Just seeing his letters again felt like a whisper from the past, soft and uninvited. I pulled it out and sat on the floor, cross-legged like I hadn't in years. The light from the hallway bulb flickered slightly, as if holding its breath with me. Inside were envelopes, copies of the cabin deed, a few old receipts, and a thick stack of letters. Letters Alan had written me, some from the early years, stationed overseas, others from after he retired, when we'd sit in the same house and still write notes because it made things feel deliberate. Loved tended. But one envelope stood out, smaller, taped shut, the name, Marjorie, written in his steady block letters. It had no stamp, no date. I opened it carefully as if it might fall apart inside. One page, folded twice. No greeting, just 5 sentences. If something happens to me before we fix the deed, don't trust Scott to bring it back. He'll mean well, but Kendall will get in his ear. Protect what matters. Keep the cabin, Mar. You'll know when it's time. My chest tightened. I read it again. And again. Alan had known. He had seen further down the road than I had dared to. He'd tried to leave me a warning and I'd buried it in a closet. A warning written in love, disguised as caution. I folded the letter back, slid it into the envelope, and held it against my chest. It didn't feel like paper. It felt like a heartbeat passed from one hand to another. I wasn't angry. I was awake. Alan hadn't left me alone. He had left me permission. I stood slowly, knees stiff, back aching, but my steps were steady. The house creaked as I walked back to the closet, box in hand. Not a single sound had changed in here, but I was no longer the same woman who had opened that door. I returned the box to the closet. Not to hide it, just to wait until I needed it again. And I would. Very soon, Kendall's text had come 2 days earlier. Party at ours for Jeremy's birthday, just family and close friends. 3 p.m. Saturday. Come if you're free. No, would love to see you. No, we miss you, just logistics. Like an afterthought with a timestamp still. I went. I told myself it was for Jeremy, 10 years old. Innocent in all this. And for Hannah, she'd be there. The driveway was full when I arrived. I parked a block down and walked. I wore the navy wool coat Alan had bought me on our anniversary in '02. A little outdated maybe, but it still fit. Still felt like armor. I carried the gift in both hands, wrapped in paper I saved from last Christmas. A science that I thought Jeremy might actually use, or at least pretend to like. When I knocked, it wasn't Scott who answered. It was Kendall. Her smile was immediate and tight. "Oh, hi! You made it," she said, already turning back into the house. No hug. I stepped inside. The hallway was full of coats already hung. Lauder spilled from the kitchen. I caught a glimpse of Scott pouring wine, gesturing grandly. No one noticed I had arrived. I found a corner near the fireplace. Watched. Waited. Took in the decor. Streamers, confetti, cake with blue frosting that spelled, "Jeremy, double digits!" I was a ghost with hands. When Hannah finally saw me, her face lit up. She crossed the room quickly and hugged me tight. "You came." "Of course," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We sat for a moment on the edge of the couch. She filled me in, school friends, her upcoming winter concert. I listened, clung to every word. Then Kendall's voice cut through the air. "Cake time! Everyone to the table." The crowd gathered. Scott placed the cake in front of Jeremy. Cameras flashed. Aunts cheered. Kids jostled for seats. I stood behind near the back. "Oh, leave a seat for Grandma," someone said. Kendall turned, smile frozen. "She's just here for the cake." Lauder followed, small but sharp. Enough to bruise. No one corrected her. Not even Scott. I didn't respond, didn't flinch. I just looked around, at the eyes that looked away, at Hannah, biting her lip, at Jeremy, too distracted to notice, at Scott, laughing with his cousin, and at Kendall, already turning back as if I had never spoken, never given, never mattered. I stepped back, closer to the hallway, closer to the door. I didn't leave. Not yet. But I had started walking out. Inside. I stood there for a while, half shadowed by the hallway wall, watching the family cheer and cut slices of cake. The scent of sugar and frosting hung thick in the air, but I couldn't taste it. I couldn't taste anything. Someone passed me a plate. I nodded politely, took it, but didn't eat. The blue frosting was too bright, artificial, loud even. Eventually, the small talk thinned. The children scattered toward the backyard. Adults began collecting dishes, refilling drinks. Aunts complimented Kendall's decorating. No one mentioned me. I left the plate on a side table and slipped out to the porch. Just for air, I told myself. The air was crisp, biting, the kind Alan loved. I stood under the awning and let it sting my cheeks, hoping it would wake something in me. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Didn't expect to see you here, Marjorie." I turned. He stood at the porch rail, gray wool coat, brown gloves, eyes that had seen more than they said. "Glenn," I said, a little surprised. Alan's old fishing buddy. They hadn't seen each other much in recent years, but he had always come to Jeremy's birthdays. "You look steady," he said, not kindly, not unkindly. "I'm trying to be," he nodded. Looked out across the street. I heard what she said inside. I didn't ask how. I just looked down at my shoes. Mud on the toes. "She's not subtle," I said. "No," Glenn replied. "She's not." But I saw who didn't speak up. That hit harder than I expected. "Alon wouldn't have let it slide," he added. "No," I whispered. "He wouldn't have." Silence stretched between us, thick but bearable. Then Glenn did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I was going to give this to Scott," he said. "But I think it should go to you." I took it, confused. "It's about the cabin," he said. "Something Alan told me to write down, just in case." My fingers tightened around the paper. "Thank you," I said. He didn't smile, just nodded once. Then walked back into the house. I didn't follow. I looked at the envelope. I didn't open it, not yet, but I would. For the first time in weeks, I felt something settle in my chest. Justice begins quietly. I didn't sleep that night. I placed Glenn's envelope on the kitchen table. I made tea I didn't drink. I folded laundry that didn't need folding. Around midnight, I sat down and finally opened it. Inside, a short letter and a small map Alan had sketched by hand. The letter was direct. Alan's voice came through even on Glenn's paper. "If Glenn gives you this, it means I'm not around to explain. I left copies of the original trust forms in the cabin, the ones naming us both as owners before Scott ever got involved. You'll find them in the floorboard under the back window, right where we hid the fishing license that summer Hannah caught her first trout. They're signed but never submitted. I didn't want to pressure you, but I also didn't want Kendall to erase you." I set the paper down. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands in my lap. Not shaking, not stunned, just still. I remembered that summer, the joy on Hannah's face, Alan's big hands guiding hers, the three of us laughing so hard my stomach hurt for days, and that tiny tin box we slid under the loose plank, wrapped in a Ziploc bag Alan said would last longer than his knees. I didn't need time to decide. By dawn, I had packed a small bag, filled the car with gas, and scribbled a note for Hannah. Just 4 words: "I'm going to Flathead." The drive took 4.5 hours. Trees blurred past, and I let them. I didn't play the radio, didn't call anyone. My thoughts were enough company. Flathead Lake came into view like an old friend waiting quietly. The road narrowed. Familiar pine branches reached out like arms. The cabin looked the same, stoic, weathered, not yet surrendered. I unlocked the door. The air inside was cold but clean. I dropped my bag by the couch, crossed the wooden floor, and went straight to the back window. The floorboard creaked exactly the same. I knelt, slid my fingers under the edge of the plank. There it was, a small tin box, dusty, untouched. I pulled it out, set it on the windowsill. My hands were steady as I opened the lid. Inside, 2 folded documents, one dated 2011, one dated 2011, both bearing Alan's signature and mine. And beneath them, a photo, Alan, me, and Hannah on the dock. I didn't cry, I didn't smile. I just said thank you, out loud. To the empty room, I carried the tin box to the small table by the window. The one where Alan used to do crosswords. The late morning sun streamed through the blinds, slicing the air into warm stripes. Dust danced in the light. The cabin felt more alive than it had in years. I unfolded the documents carefully. The paper had yellowed, but the ink was clear. My signature, Alan's. Witnessed by Glenn, I noticed a postmark stamp on the envelope that had held the papers. Helena M. March 4, 2011. That was important, because it was 9 years before Scott ever brought up refinancing. 9 years before I signed anything giving up ownership. I laid both documents side by side, comparing the dates. Mine and Alan's agreement was clearly earlier. The trust form bore legal formatting, including a notary seal faintly smudged but still legible. It wasn't just sentimental, it was valid. I pulled out my laptop from the bag and connected to my phone's hotspot. The signal was weak, but it worked. I searched Montana estate law. I typed slowly, carefully, revocable trust prior to new deed. Estate disputes when earlier documents exist. The answers came in legal jargon, but the meaning was clear enough. If a legal trust exists prior to any property transfer and was never properly revoked, then it can challenge any later ownership claim. Alan had left me more than a letter. He'd left me leverage. I printed the documents with the portable printer I kept for emergencies. It hummed like a small promise. Then I placed the originals back in the tin, sealed it again, and slid it under the floorboard, right where I found it, just in case. As I sat back in the wooden chair, I looked around the cabin. The walls held echoes, laughter, arguments, long winters and longer forgiveness. I had been here as a wife, as a mother, as a shadow. Now I was here as something else. Someone who knew the difference between being quiet and being erased. And I was done being erased. I didn't tell Scott. I didn't tell Kendall. I drove straight from Flathead back to Missoula, stopping only once for coffee and gas. The air smelled like pine and frost, cleaner than it had in weeks. I drove with the windows half down. I needed the cold to stay alert. I needed to feel alive. By noon the next day, I was sitting in the waiting room of Kavanaugh and Bell, Alan's old law firm. The receptionist looked up, surprised. "Mrs. Daniels?" "Yes." I was holding up a sealed manila envelope. "I'm here to see Franklin." He came out 10 minutes later, grayer than I remembered, but still with the same sharp eyes. He smiled gently. "Marjorie," he said, "I've been wondering when I might see you again." We shook hands. "I found something," I said. "Alan left it for me. And I need to know exactly what it means." We sat in his office, a room filled with framed degrees, antique books, and the faint scent of pipe tobacco. I slid the documents across the desk. He read in silence, occasionally adjusting his glasses, turning pages slowly, carefully. When he finished, he looked up. "Did you know this existed?" he asked. "Not until 3 days ago." He nodded. "It's strong, sign dated, notarized, and legally, unless Alan explicitly revoked it, which we have no record of. This document holds weight, especially with the postmark. So I have a case." "You have more than a case. You have the truth. On paper." I didn't smile. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and handed him a small slip of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "My instructions." "File it?" "Quietly. No notice to Scott or Kendall. Not yet. Just secure my rights and prepare whatever you need." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "I'll take care of it." As I walked out into the bright afternoon light, I didn't feel triumphant. But I felt stable, like a house after a long storm. Nothing had changed on the outside. But inside, the foundation had shifted, and it was holding. The next morning, I opened the mailbox for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. It groaned like a tired joint. Inside, Bill's flyers and a white envelope with floral trim. A wedding invitation. I recognized Hannah's handwriting immediately. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Scott Daniels, plus guest. There was no mention of me. Not even a blank line for a name. Just the phrase, "With Dad." I stood on the porch, letter in hand. Heart quiet but heavy, I opened it anyway. The invitation was tasteful. Elegant script, spring colors. Venue near Helena. Reception to follow. I wasn't surprised. I was expected to know my place. Again, expected to assume that "with Dad" somehow covered me. It didn't. I closed the envelope, carried it inside, and set it on the kitchen counter. Then I pulled open the drawer where I kept blank paper, envelopes, a few old pens. I sat down and began to write. Not a letter to Hannah, not to Scott, not to Kendall, but to the courthouse. I requested a certified copy of the trust documents. Then I wrote a second letter, this time to Franklin. I asked for a timeline of steps, quiet enforcement, if needed, a formal cease and desist. The pen moved slowly but steadily. When I finished, I looked up. The sun had shifted on the kitchen tile. My shadow no longer fell across the counter, and I realized for the first time in years I had written my name with intention, not as someone's mother, not as someone's widow, but as Marjorie, owner, in full. It started with a phone call from Scott. Mid-morning, my landline rang, shrill and persistent. I let it go to voicemail, but he called again, then my cell, 3 times. Finally, I answered. "Mom, why is the cabin account frozen? No hello? No pause?" "I assume because it's under review," I said calmly. "You froze it." "I didn't say that. You know we have expenses coming up. The roof, the septic maintenance. I suggest you hold off on any repairs until we clarify ownership." Silence. Then, "This is ridiculous." "No. What was ridiculous was removing my name and assuming I'd stay quiet. He sighed heavily. The same sigh he gave me when he was 16 and caught lying about test scores. Look, Mom, I know you've been off lately, since Dad passed. You're grieving, I get it. I sat down, let him talk. But freezing accounts, hiring lawyers, that's not you. I think you've mistaken silence for weakness. Another pause. Then a new voice joined. Kendall. I didn't hear her enter the call, but I recognized the tone immediately. Marjorie, she said sweetly, we're really trying to keep things civil. But this could cause damage not just to us, but to Hannah's wedding. Do you really want to ruin that? I smiled, though no one could see it. I'm not ruining anything. I'm simply enforcing what Alan and I agreed to over a decade ago. Kendall huffed. This feels vindictive. No, dear. Vindictive would be doing it in public. Click. She hung up first. Scott was still on the line. She didn't mean that. He muttered. I'm sure she did. Is this really what you want? A legal battle? No, Scott. What I wanted was to never need one. He didn't answer. Goodbye, I said. Then I placed the phone gently on the hook. My hands didn't shake. I looked out the window. The light had changed again. Not brighter, just clearer. By noon, the calls stopped. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was strategy. Kendall had gone quiet, which meant only one thing: she was busy crafting a new angle. I didn't have to wait long. That evening, I got a voicemail from a mutual acquaintance, Susan from the Historical Society. Hey Marjorie, just checking in. I ran into Kendall at the market end. She said you've been having memory trouble. Just wanted to see if you were okay. There it was. The whisper campaign. I deleted the message. Then I picked up the phone again. But this time, I called Dr. Bellamy. He had been Alan's doctor for years. After Alan passed, I kept him as my primary. I trusted him, not just with prescriptions, but with truth. Dr. Bellamy, I said when he picked up, I'd like to schedule a cognitive assessment. Full scope. Written confirmation. He didn't ask why. He just said, of course, Marjorie. I'll block time tomorrow morning. I slept well that night. It surprised me. Maybe it was the act of preparing instead of reacting. Maybe it was knowing that truth, once confirmed, couldn't be undone by gossip. The next morning, I arrived early. The nurse greeted me like an old friend. We laughed about the time I mistook saline drops for glue in Alan's toolbox. Then the tests began. Word recall, pattern matching, logic games, reading comprehension. Dr. Bellamy took his time, asked careful questions, made notes. When we were done, he looked at me and said, "You passed with clarity, higher than average for your age. I'll have the report notarized and delivered to your attorney." I nodded. "Thank you," I said. "I just wanted something on paper." He smiled. "In case someone forgets who you are?" "Exactly." That afternoon, I framed a copy for myself and placed it right beside Alan's photo. The next day, I drove out to the old chapel near Flathead. The one Alan used to help maintain, tightening pew bolts, patching the roof each fall. It had weathered time better than most things in my life. I pulled into the gravel lot just past noon. The trees had gone golden, their leaves like fire against the sky. I walked slow the way people do when memory meets the present. Inside, it smelled of cedar and hymnals. I knew the small office off the sanctuary well. Pastor Ellis looked up from his ledger. "Marjorie Daniels," he said with a smile. "Well now, this is a grace." I smiled back. "Mind if I leave something for safekeeping?" He didn't ask what. Just nodded and pushed the old lockbox toward me. I opened my purse and took out a flat envelope, sealed, labeled, and signed across the flap. "Legal records?" I said. "Backup copy? Not to be opened unless something happens to me or if I ask." "Understood." He placed it beneath the marriage license registry, tucked beneath decades of union. "Alon, be proud," he said gently. "I hope so." On my way out, I stood in the back pew for a while. The stained glass glowed in silence. No music, no crowd, just light and me. I wasn't hiding anything. I was securing it. Quiet justice doesn't need an audience. Just a record. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Scott's name was on the envelope, but it had Franklin's return address. Legal stationery, stamped and sealed. I could imagine the moment he opened it. The furrowed brow, the slow exhale, the look toward Kendall before handing it over. I didn't have to wait long. By Friday morning, my phone rang. I didn't answer. He texted, "We need to talk." Now? Then Kendall. "Really? Marjorie? This is how you want to handle things?" I didn't respond. Instead, I made tea, sat on the porch, watched two squirrels chase each other along the fence line. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, Scott, arms crossed. Kendall behind him, her jaw tight, clutching a folder. I opened the door but didn't move aside. "Can we come in?" Scott asked. "You're already here?" I said and turned back toward the kitchen. They followed, sat at the dining table without invitation. Kendall slapped the folder down. "Are you trying to destroy your family?" "No," I said evenly. "I'm trying to restore what you attempted to erase." Scott leaned forward. "Mom, you blindsided us. Freezing accounts, legal filings, you think this is what Dad would have wanted?" I stared at him. "You mean the documents Dad signed and hid away so I'd have a way back when I was removed without consent?" Silence. "I never revoked my share," I continued. "Ellen didn't either. What you filed was incomplete. What I'm enforcing is what's legally and ethically mine." Kendall's tone sharpened. "You know what this looks like to people, right? An old woman, confused by grief, manipulated into filing claims." I walked to the counter, picked up a folder of my own, opened it, slid out a copy of the notarized cognitive assessment. "I had it done last week," I said. "Feel free to read it aloud." Kendall paled. "Scott didn't even reach for it." No one spoke, so I did. "This cabin, this account, this legacy, you tried to take them in the quiet. I'm simply answering in kind." I stood. They stayed seated. "I won't be bullied in my own house," I said softly. "Not anymore." And I meant every word. They didn't return that weekend. No calls, no follow-up. But the silence was heavier than before, pressurized like a storm gathering. On Monday, Franklin forwarded a notice. Kendall and Scott had retained a lawyer. Not to challenge the documents. They knew better. Instead, they filed a motion to delay enforcement, claiming undue stress on the family, reputational harm to their daughter's wedding. Franklin's response was sharp. Attached to his email was a draft letter to the judge outlining not just the legality of the trust, but the pattern of manipulation I had endured. "You okay with this tone?" he had asked. I replied with one word, stronger. Later that afternoon, I walked to the market. Took my time. I passed by the notice board where someone had posted a flyer for a community garden. I took a tab with the number. Small decisions, steady feet. That evening, I started sorting through the basement boxes Alan had packed before his final hospital visit. Inside one was a folder labeled Flathead Originals, birth certificates, marriage license, cabin blueprints, even a hand-drawn map Alan had once made for the septic team, complete with his scribbles, "Never plant lilacs here. Roots too wild." I laughed out loud. Then I cried, quietly, in gratitude, for a man who thought ahead, and for a self that was finally catching up. By midweek, the judge denied their motion. Franklin called me with the news. I could hear the smile in his voice. "You're officially co-owner again, Marjorie. Retroactive." "Immediate?" I didn't cheer. I just said, "Good." That night, I called Hannah. She didn't answer, but she texted an hour later. "I saw the documents. I don't know what to say." I waited, then typed, "You don't have to say anything. Just know this isn't revenge. It's repair." No reply, and that was okay. The next morning, I returned to Flathead. The cabin greeted me like it always did, with creaking steps and a screen door that stuck halfway. I swept the floor, opened the windows, let air and light in. Then I took out the framed cognitive report, placed it beside the stove, not as a weapon, as proof. Then I unpacked a box labeled Porch Tools. Alan's label, inside gloves, a kneeling pad, and an old screwdriver. I began reattaching the loose railing, one screw at a time. Quiet justice doesn't always feel like thunder. Sometimes it just sounds like a hinge catching and holding. The wind at Flathead had softened by morning. Leaves clung stubbornly to the birch trees outside. I stood on the porch, wrapped in Alan's old jacket, watching the sky turn its slow shade of silver. A letter sat in my lap. This time not legal. It was from Mary Hobson, an old friend from the church committee. She had heard. Somehow, not the whole story, but enough. Enough to say, if you ever want to turn that cabin into something for others, I know women who'd need it. That line stuck with me. I walked inside, lit the small stove, and stood by it as water warmed. What would it look like? To open the cabin's doors not for family, but for women like me, women discarded politely, diminished in small, cruel increments. By mid-morning, I had made a list. Names, situations: Jane from Bingo Group, widowed, living with a son who kept the thermostat at 60. Margot, who whispered about not being allowed to drive anymore. Teresa, who hadn't heard from her daughter since May. Not charity, dignity. I started drafting a message to Pastor Ellis. Asked if the church had a weekend where the retreat hall wouldn't be used. Then I wrote to Franklin, would it be possible to create a protective use clause? So this space can't be co-opted by Scott or anyone else? His answer came quick. Yes, I'll draw it up. By afternoon, I was scrubbing the old guest bathroom. There was rust on the faucet and a family of spiders behind the mirror. I hummed as I worked. The rhythm felt familiar. When I paused, I looked at myself in that dusty glass. My hair was thinner, my back not as straight, but my eyes clear, steady, alive. The first woman who visited was named Evelyn. She didn't bring much, just a duffel bag and a paperback missing its cover. Her hands trembled when she handed me a thank you card, unwritten, just blank inside. But her eyes, they were brimming. I wasn't sure you were real, she said softly. Neither was I once, I replied. We sat on the porch that evening. The lake stretched quiet in front of us. She asked nothing about Scott or Kendall. I offered no explanation. Instead, I passed her a blanket, and she offered silence in return. Sometimes healing sounds like that. A week later came Denise, then Joanie. Each brought their own ghosts. None of them asked to be saved. They just needed space where their worth wasn't measured by who still called or how useful they remained. One night, I caught Evelyn in the living room, holding the photo of Alan and me on the dock. She looked up, almost apologetic. He thought ahead, didn't he? He did? I said. She nodded. I never had anyone think ahead for me. Now you do, I thought, but didn't say. Because this wasn't about being a savior. It was about creating a place where no woman would be erased quietly or otherwise. And as I turned out the lights that night, I realized the cabin had never felt more alive, not as a symbol of loss, but as a home reclaimed. It had been a year. Spring again. The birch trees outside were beginning to leaf out, tender green pushing through gray branches. The lake shimmered, not with drama, but with quiet rhythm. I had just finished planting 3 rows of marigolds along the cabin walkway when I saw the envelope. It wasn't legal, wasn't from the church, it was from Hannah. The handwriting stopped me. Slanted neat. Hers. I held it a long time before opening. Inside, a postcard, the front, a watercolor of Flathead Lake. The back 10 words. Can I visit the cabin sometime? Just me, love H, no apology, no explanations. But no demands either. I placed the postcard on the table by the window. Sunlight fell across it, warming the ink. I didn't move it. Didn't answer. Not yet. I poured tea and sat by the porch where the rocking chair creaked with wind. Evelyn had just left that morning. Her sister had found her an apartment in Spokane. Joanie was painting in the back room. Denise had gone to visit her grandson in Portland. The house was, for once, quiet. I let the silence settle. Over the past year, I'd learned that justice doesn't always arrive with noise, and neither does healing. It comes like spring, inch by inch, root by root. Sometimes it brings people back, and sometimes it just brings you back to yourself. I glanced at the postcard again. She had written, Nov, not sincerely, not take care. That mattered. But I wouldn't rush. Not because I held a grudge, but because I finally understood the value of choosing when to open your door and when to let someone knock a little longer. She arrived on a Tuesday. No call, no text, just the crunch of tires on gravel and the faint slam of a car door. I looked out the window. She stood at the edge of the path, one hand gripping her purse strap. No Kendall, no entourage, just Hannah, hair tied back, eyes uncertain. I opened the door but didn't speak. She didn't either. She walked up slowly, then stopped a few feet from the porch. I'm not here for answers, she said. I just missed you. The words hung in the spring air. I stepped aside. She came in, took off her shoes, like she always used to. Her eyes scanned the living room, new cushions, Joanie's painting on the wall, fresh flowers in a mason jar. So much is different, she murmured. Some things had to be. I said. We sat at the table. I poured tea. She held the cup with both hands, like she needed its warmth more than anything I could say. I know I was quiet when I shouldn't have been, she said. I didn't nod. Didn't reassure. I let her sit with it. After a long pause, she looked at me. I don't expect anything, but I wanted to try. And maybe that was the most honest sentence I'd ever heard from her. So I got up, walked to the cupboard, and pulled down a second mug. You'll need this tomorrow, I said. She blinked. Tomorrow, we're planting the next row of marigolds. Her face softened. Not redemption, but a beginning. If you've made it this far, thank you. Not just for listening, but for holding space for women like me. Women who get quiet when the world gets cruel, but rise anyway. If this story touched a part of you, share it. Tell someone who needs to hear they're not invisible, not forgotten, not erased. Comment below. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? And let me know where you're watching from. Because this legacy, it's not just mine, it's ours now.